You're looking at a job posting for an international logistics company. Competitive salary, travel opportunities, dynamic work environment. You submit your resume, and 3 weeks later, you're sitting across from a man in an expensive suit who never quite answers when you ask what the company actually ships. That's how it starts for most people who end up in this world. The arms trade isn't what you think it is. There's no smoky backroom deal with briefcases full of cash, at least not at first. The legal arms industry is worth over $400 billion annually, and it operates in plain sight. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon. These companies have websites, they have stock tickers, they employ hundreds of thousands of people who go home to their families every night and don't think twice about what they build. You start in the legitimate world. Maybe you're working for a freight forwarding company that specializes in sensitive cargo. Maybe you're in procurement for a defense contractor. Maybe you're a translator who speaks Arabic and Russian and finds yourself in meetings where everyone's extremely interested in your discretion. The point is, you don't wake up one day and decide to become an arms dealer. You slide into it. Your first real deal happens almost by accident. A contact mentions that a friendly government needs spare parts for Soviet-era helicopters. Nothing illegal about it. The State Department approves these transactions every day. You know a supplier in Eastern Europe. You make an introduction. 2 months later, there's $50,000 in your account. Commission for connecting two parties who wanted to do business anyway. That's the hook right there. $50,000 for making a phone call and filling out paperwork. You start thinking about the math. If one small deal pays that much, what about a bigger one? What about 10 deals? What about cutting out the middleman and becoming the primary broker yourself? Here's what nobody tells you about registering as an arms broker with the State Department's Office of Defense Trade Controls. It's shockingly easy. You fill out forms, you pay fees, you provide references, you promise to follow the Arms Export Control Act and the International Traffic in Arms regulations. They run a background check. If you're clean, you're approved. You're now legally authorized to broker weapons deals between foreign governments. The first year is a learning curve steeper than anything you've experienced. You need to understand export control laws for dozens of countries. You need to know which governments are under embargo and which ones just have complicated restrictions. You need to learn the difference between end-user certificates that will pass scrutiny and ones that won't. You need to build relationships with suppliers who can actually deliver what they promise. You also need to understand the weapons themselves. A general says he needs anti-aircraft capabilities. Does he want man-portable systems or vehicle-mounted? What's his threat environment? What's his budget? What can his troops actually operate and maintain? You're not just moving boxes. You're solving military problems for people who will die if you get it wrong. Your network expands. You know freight forwarders in Dubai who can move anything anywhere. You know bankers in Cyprus who understand how to structure payments through multiple jurisdictions. You know a guy in Bulgaria who has access to warehouses full of ammunition manufactured during the Cold War. You know which officials in which countries can be persuaded to sign the right documents. The money scales faster than you expected. Your second year, you clear $500,000 in commissions. Your third year, $2 million. You buy a nice apartment. You travel business class. You eat at restaurants where the menu doesn't have prices. You're still operating legally, mostly, but you're starting to see how thin that line really is. Because here's the thing about end-user certificates. They're supposed to guarantee that weapons go where they're supposed to go and get used for legitimate purposes. But a corrupt official in the right country will sign anything for the right price. You tell yourself you're not responsible for what happens after delivery. You're just a middleman, a facilitator. Then someone approaches you with a different kind of opportunity. Not government to government, not quite legal, but not quite illegal either. A militia group that's fighting against a regime the United States doesn't like. They need weapons. They have money. The State Department can't officially arm them, but they're not exactly trying to stop anyone else from doing it either. This is the decision point. This is where you either walk away and stay in the comfortable world of legitimate defense contracts, or you step across into something darker. The money is better, 10 times better, But there's no diplomatic immunity if something goes wrong. No congressional oversight, no paper trail that leads back to Washington. You take 72 hours to think about it. You know you're going to say yes before the first hour is up. Level 2, the grey zone operator. The first shipment is 50,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition. Eastern European surplus from the 1980s. The end-user certificate says it's going to the national police force of an allied African nation. That's technically true. What the certificate doesn't mention is that half the national police force is also part of the militia you're actually supplying. You structure the deal through 3 shell companies, one in Cyprus, one in the Seychelles, one in Dubai. The payment comes in 4 wire transfers from banks in different countries. Your commission is deposited in an account in Singapore. The ammunition ships from Bulgaria to a port in East Africa, then gets trucked across the border in vehicles that belong to a logistics company you've never heard of. You never touch the weapons, you never see the money move, you're just coordinating paperwork and making introductions. If anyone investigates, there's nothing directly connecting you to anything illegal. The profit is $800,000. You made that in 6 weeks. Your old government contracts suddenly feel like pocket change. The second deal is bigger. Surface-to-air missiles. Not the sophisticated American systems that cost millions, but older Soviet designs that are still effective against helicopters and low-flying aircraft. The buyer is a rebel group fighting a civil war in the Middle East. They're technically terrorists according to some definitions, freedom fighters according to others. The CIA has been quietly supporting them for 2 years, but Congress won't authorize direct military aid. You're the solution to that problem. A former colleague from the State Department calls you. Not officially, just a conversation between old friends. He mentions that certain shipments to certain groups would be unlikely to attract scrutiny from federal investigators. He doesn't explicitly tell you to arm the rebels. He just makes sure you understand that nobody's going to stop you. This is how foreign policy actually works. The official channels are for press releases and congressional testimony. The real work happens through contractors and middlemen who can be disavowed if anything goes public. You source the missiles from Ukraine. A defense ministry official signs off on the export in exchange for a payment that never appears in any budget document. The missiles are listed as destined for a training facility in Jordan. They never arrive in Jordan. They get diverted to a warehouse in Turkey, then smuggled across the border in trucks carrying humanitarian supplies. The rebels now have air defense capabilities. Government helicopters start getting shot down. The civil war intensifies. Thousands more people die. You tell yourself those people were dying anyway. You tell yourself the alternative was letting a brutal dictator crush a popular uprising. You tell yourself that someone was going to arm these rebels regardless, so it might as well be you. The money helps you believe it. $2.3 million in commissions. You buy a house. Not in Virginia anymore, somewhere with better privacy laws and less curiosity about where your money comes from. You travel constantly. Dubai, Istanbul, Nairobi, Bangkok. You meet buyers in hotel lobbies and sellers in airport lounges. You never discuss specifics over the phone. You never send emails that explicitly mention weapons. Everything is coded. Agricultural equipment, industrial machinery, spare parts. Everyone knows what you're really talking about. The network grows. You know a guy in Serbia who has access to warehouses full of assault rifles. You know a shipping agent in Djibouti who can get containers through customs without inspection. You know a banker in Zurich who specializes in structuring payments that don't trigger reporting requirements. You know which officials in which countries will sign end-user certificates for $50,000, which ones need $100,000, which ones want payment in diamonds instead of cash. The business has its own logic, its own ecosystem. Weapons flow from countries with surplus inventory to countries with active conflicts. Money flows in the opposite direction through banks that don't ask questions. Everyone takes their cut. The manufacturers, the officials, the shippers, the brokers. It's not personal. It's just commerce. Then you get the call that changes everything. A buyer wants something you've never dealt with before. Not rifles or missiles or ammunition. Chemical weapons. Specifically, they want access to a stockpile that's supposed to have been destroyed years ago. The stockpile exists. You know it exists because you've heard rumors from 3 separate sources. Someone in a government that's supposed to be destroying these weapons is willing to sell instead of incinerate. The commission would be 7 figures, maybe 8. But chemical weapons are different. This isn't arming rebels or supplying militias. This is selling the tools for mass civilian casualties, for war crimes, for the kind of attacks that make international headlines and trigger interventions. You have 48 hours to decide. You say no, not because you've suddenly developed a conscience, not because you're worried about the victims, because chemical weapons represent a different category of risk. Conventional arms leave bodies, but rarely leave traces back to the broker. Chemical attacks trigger international investigations, forensic analysis, diplomatic crises, the kind of scrutiny that unravels entire networks. You've seen it happen. An arms dealer in Belgium facilitated a sarin precursor sale in 2013. 3 years later, investigators connected the dots. He's serving 18 years in a prison where nobody speaks his language. His assets were seized across 4 countries. His family disowned him to avoid association. That's what happens when you cross certain lines. The buyer doesn't take the rejection well. They make vague threats about exposing your previous transactions. You remind them that exposure works both ways. They have as much to lose as you do, probably more. The conversation ends. You change your phone number. You avoid certain cities for 6 months. The network adjusts. It always does. But something shifts after that call. You start noticing things you ignored before. The casualty reports from conflicts where you supplied weapons. The refugee camps full of people fleeing wars that your transactions helped fuel. The children in hospitals missing limbs from cluster munitions you helped procure. You always knew this intellectually. You just never let yourself feel it. Now you can't stop feeling it. You try to rationalize it the way you always have. Someone else would have supplied those weapons. The conflicts would have happened regardless. You're just a middleman facilitating transactions between willing parties. But the rationalizations don't work as well anymore. You start drinking more, sleeping less. The houses and the bank accounts and the expensive watches don't feel like achievements anymore. They feel like receipts, documentation of transactions measured in ammunition and casualties. You consider getting out, just walking away, but there's no retirement plan for arms dealers. Victor Bout tried to retire. He got bored, took one more deal and ended up in an American prison for 25 years. The DEA set up a sting operation in Thailand. Agents posed as representatives of a Colombian rebel group. Bout flew in to discuss selling surface-to-air missiles and armor-piercing rockets. The moment he agreed to the deal, they arrested him. He thought he was untouchable because he'd never set foot in America. He was wrong. Extradition treaties and international law enforcement cooperation have gotten significantly more effective since the 1980s, when dealers like Adnan Khashoggi operated with near impunity. You could cooperate with authorities, turn informant, trade information about your network for immunity. But informants in this business don't live long. There are too many people with too much money invested in keeping certain transactions quiet. You've heard stories about cooperating witnesses who made it into protection programs only to be found dead years later in countries that supposedly didn't know their new identities. The networks have long memories and longer reach, so you keep operating. More carefully now, smaller deals, lower profile clients. You avoid anything that might attract serious attention. You stick to conventional weapons in markets where enforcement is minimal. You launder money through more intermediaries. You communicate through more encrypted channels. You meet contacts in countries with weak extradition agreements. The paranoia becomes routine, checking for surveillance before every meeting, changing hotels every night, assuming every phone is compromised, trusting nobody completely. The money keeps coming. Not as much as before, but enough. You've diversified into legitimate businesses. Real estate in Dubai, import-export companies in Singapore, consulting firms in London, None of them are entirely clean, but they're clean enough to withstand casual scrutiny. The arms dealing becomes one revenue stream among several. You tell yourself you're transitioning out. You tell yourself you're building an exit strategy, but the phone keeps ringing. A militia in Africa needs anti-tank weapons. A rebel group in Asia needs ammunition. A government official in Eastern Europe has surplus inventory he needs to move quietly. The transactions are simple. The commissions are substantial. The risks feel manageable. You keep saying yes. Just one more deal. Just one more commission. Just one more transaction to pad the retirement fund. You're sitting in a hotel room in Istanbul when you realize you've become exactly what you promised yourself you'd never be. Not the sophisticated operator facilitating strategic transactions, not the necessary intermediary in complex geopolitical situations, just a guy who sells tools of violence to people who use them to kill other people. The rationalizations were always lies. You knew it. You just didn't want to admit it. The business doesn't have honor or principles. It has profit margins and plausible deniability. You've built a career on helping people kill each other more efficiently. That's the truth you've been avoiding for 15 years. And now you're sitting in a hotel room in a foreign country with 3 passports, 2 phones, and more money than you can ever spend, wondering if any of it was worth what it cost. You can't get that time back. You can't undo the transactions. You can't bring back the people killed with weapons you brokered. The money sitting in offshore accounts doesn't change what you traded to get it. Some doors only open one way, and once you walk through, you spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for the knock that finally comes.